Bing, 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 bing. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Look at everyone popping in. There's Charles Alexander and Pat Jones and so many of my friends. Wow, we have people here today from the UK. We have people here from Mumbai, India. We have people from San Francisco, San Diego, Denver, Dallas, Houston. We are a global community, guys. We are a global community. And live, I don't see Sue there this morning, which I'd expect to see her, but that's okay. And anyhow, you're all, hey, welcome. I'm glad you're all here. This is such an important meeting, I think, for all of us. I'm going to ask you to humor me for one thing. I'm going to take a group picture of everybody with mask on. I don't have mine on only because if I have mine on, you can't hear me. Maybe an advantage sometimes, I think. But so let's put our mask on if you have them, and if you don't, just smile. Please turn on your videos so we can see your pretty faces and combed hair. And this picture is something we're going to share, and also select our winners of our, which I just love these. I don't know if you see that or not. That's our PF Warrior cups, and we've invested so we can give all of our members a cup. We have some criteria which I'll talk about later. You'll be getting a separate email about the cups and the promotion and the winners. So let me mask up here. Okay. If you don't have a mask, that's okay. It just means you don't get a cup. But hey, it's just anyway. Okay. That's good. That's good. Oh, good. There you go. Jim McDonald. I knew he had to be there for his cup. I knew it. Okay. All right. Well, thank you. I'm going to take my mask off. We got our picture done. Thank you so much for being here. We have two wonderful speakers this morning, which I'm going to let Shelley introduce. And our one speaker, surprisingly this morning, literally, he's active as a clinician and had to engage a patient into a COVID, I think a COVID trial, if I'm not mistaken. So he can talk about that when he's here. And Shelley, you're on.
Yes. So happy Halloween, everybody. I don't know if you all do this crazy decorating and wearing of costumes in the UK, but we love it here in the US. And also thank all of you who have made donations to the PF Warriors. We've gotten some really wonderful donations. And remember, you can do that on the PF Warrior website, www.pfwarrior.com. And this is how we can bring great programming to you and other things, information to help people. So it is scary to be talking about this virus because getting consistent factual information about COVID-19 and the status of the vaccination program seems elusive sometimes. So we are lucky to have these two speakers. Since one is in a clinical trial right now, we have our favorite, Dr. Susan Mathai, who is brilliant and beautiful. Susan Mathai is a pulmonary disease specialist here in Dallas and at Baylor with both a clinical and research focus. She graduated with honors from Yale University School of Medicine. My goodness, I'm so impressed with that. And has more than 11 years of diverse experience in pulmonary diseases. And I have asked her to answer a big question I think all of us have. We read that through the American Thoracic Society that people with PF who get COVID-19 have a 49% death rate. What happens to the other 51% if they get it? We need to know, and how can we protect ourselves? Susan Mathai, you're on.
Hi, so thanks a lot for asking me to speak. Dr. Robert Gottlieb should be logging in soon. He's by training a cardiologist, but also did a PhD in virology and stuff. And so he's going to actually address some of the technical, he's leading most of the clinical trials that are actively enrolling at Baylor. And so he's going to sort of try to address a lot of the vaccine specific things. And so what I did, I'm not sure how many of you guys were at the beginning of all this in May. We had I did a brief talk about what we knew at that time. So I've updated that a little bit, and then I've tried to address some of the questions that Shelley thought would be really important I think she got from many of you in some of the slides as part of my update. So I'll go through the background stuff pretty quickly and try to get to the question. And I will also show some of that data that Shelley mentioned from the recently published study out of Europe, trying to understand like how ILD patients fare with COVID. So that's, again, a lot of this is really late breaking stuff. And I think as the months go on, we're learning more and more. So let me share my screen. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint. Can you guys see that? Okay. So this is basically an update version of the previous talk. I'm sorry, I'll try to get through the basics, but I just want to lay the groundwork so that we're all on the same page about what we're talking about. I don't have any disclosures.
Dr. Matai, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm going to let Dr. Gottlieb enter. He's in the waiting room right now.
Okay, awesome.
And let me just welcome him very quickly, and then we'll turn it back over to you. It'll take 1 second here. Dr. Gottlieb, we're just starting a presentation with Dr. Matai. I just want to say welcome. We are glad you're here. And Dr. Matai, if you'll finish up, and then perhaps you can help Shelley introduce Dr. Gottlieb.
Yeah. Robert, I'm just going to do a brief update on the kind of basic info of on COVID that updates a session I did earlier at the beginning of the pandemic with the same group. So it just has a little more data, and then I'm going to hand the baton to you. So I have no disclosures, just so y'all know. And I always start with this caveat. This is general information. Question specific to you, your disease, and your meds. You should definitely talk to your ILD doctor. And this is a rapidly changing field of medicine. So a lot of the things, you'll see there are updates to different numbers that we talked about in more depth in May. And a lot of the things that Dr. Gottlieb's also going to share are things that are in studies. And so we're all waiting both on the medical side and the patient side to understand kind of some of the results of the things that he's actively involved in helping study. So this was the outline of the original presentation. I'm going to spin through a lot of it, but as you guys know, back in May, I showed a version of this slide that is from the Johns Hopkins website that kind of reports numbers. As you can see, globally, we're at over 45 million cases and over 1 million deaths. And right now in the United States, we're at close to 230,000 deaths from COVID. So that's kind of to give you a sense of where things are, but also to give you this resource of somewhere where if you're interested in looking at numbers, is sort of a place where a lot of clinicians look at as well. So we talked about back in May, what is COVID-19? It's the illness caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So when you see SARS-CoV-2, that's referring to the actual virus, and COVID-19 is the illness that we get from it. Coronaviruses are common. They cause we've all had them before. They cause common colds, but more recently in 2003 and 2012, more virulent or more dangerous versions of coronavirus have jumped from animals to humans and caused outbreaks. And the most recently it was in what started in 2019, and because it was in 2019, it's called the illness that came from it as COVID-19. And that was when it was first reported starting in China, but then spread worldwide quickly thereafter. We talked in May about why does SARS-CoV-2, the virus, make you sick? The viruses enter regular human cells and interrupt their function, which causes direct damage to your tissues and cells. And then your immune system's attempt to control this can make you quite sick. And that's what we see a lot in our ICU patients. Why is this causing more problems than other viruses? This is a new virus to us. So unlike a lot of the other viruses that we've seen many times, having grown up in the United States, going to school, getting sick over and over, this is a new virus. So we don't have antibodies that we've built up over the years of our life to fight them. And so, and then we also don't have vaccines yet. And so Dr. Gottlieb's going to address that in more detail. But that's kind of one of the hopes to prevent us from getting ill going forward. Just to review the early signs and symptoms, usually people develop symptoms if they're going to get sick 5 to 6 days after exposure. Most commonly, the symptoms that you're going to notice are fever, dry cough, fatigue, aches, pain, sore throat. Some people have gastrointestinal stuff like diarrhea. And then there's the loss of taste and smell, which is not totally unique to COVID-19, but is one of those things that a lot of survivors have reported. In more severe disease, people become short of breath, develop chest pain or chest pressure, and then decreased ability to move and speak. This is but as I mentioned, this virus is problematic because we don't have any immunity to it from our own lived experience and our own buildup of antibodies. It's also very easily spread. And most troublingly, a lot of people that don't know that they are carrying the virus are able to spread it. And so that's why it's been hard in all over the world to control the spread of this, because younger people my age who may have no idea that they are ill, or even older people who don't have any symptoms, may think that they're completely fine and not putting anyone at risk, and then end up spreading it to a lot of people. It often causes severe pneumonia, though you guys are probably pretty well used to looking at CT scans. And these are sort of cartoons of what CT scans in a lot of COVID patients look like. So the A column are like what a normal slice of a CT scan might look like. And then the B shows these areas of fuzziness, or what we call ground glass opacity, that can progress to become really severe in COVID pneumonia. But in addition to causing severe lung problems, it can cause heart involvement, liver involvement, kidney failure. Those with severe disease take a long time to get better. So there are a lot of the ICU stays are way longer than what we normally expect for people who get pneumonias or viral or the flu or what have you. But now, and this is the red part, is kind of the update part, is we are starting to see patients who have had COVID-19 and were admitted to the hospital or had a bout of it and knew that they had it, coming to clinic. And some patients, not all, appear to develop abnormalities that look like forms of interstitial lung disease. Some of them have fibrotic change. Some of them have more of the persistent ground glass and other of these like kind of ILD spectrum abnormalities. This is a really active area of research. We don't know whether these people will always have them, and like in IPF where we can't get rid of those abnormalities, or whether they will be responsive to steroids or other treatment. And that's something that you are likely to see a lot more about in the coming weeks and months as we start to see more and more survivors come to see us for their post-COVID care. As I mentioned, this is sort of, again, an update from a previous slide. This virus is problematic because people can develop severe pneumonia in addition to other organ failure. And the people who do get very sick take a long time to recover and get out of the hospital, and often require long rehab. There are also unusual things that we have been noted in the literature, and pretty much every institution taking care of a lot of these patients, which include an unusually high rate of clotting problems and stroke, even in younger patients. The early estimates, this is from the publication back in April, about 1 in 5 people who get COVID-19 were estimated to require hospitalization. At that time, we talked about flattening the curve. I think that we're a little bit beyond that language, but it's still, the concept is still important. A lot of the reasons that we saw so much havoc and death was due to both COVID-19 itself, but then the fact that the severity of how many patients that our hospital system had to take care of across the country all of a sudden overwhelmed the ability of the healthcare system to treat other illnesses too. And that's why there was so much of a push on this concept of flattening the curve, of doing our part to try to keep transmissions down, so that people who are having heart attacks, strokes, other problems where they needed to go to the hospital, there'd still be beds and capacity for doctors and surgeons to take care of those other issues. And that will, even though in some of the acute big influx of patients is over from the March and April, our experiences in March, April, and May, we are still concerned about overwhelming hospital capacity. In El Paso, you guys may have heard about, in El Paso, they're having to send patients to other hospitals because they're running out of beds there. And, with flu season coming, we continue to be concerned about that. So even though that language about flattening the curve is not being used as much in the media, I think it's important to continue to think about our responsibility, not just to each other, but to the community at large and people we don't even know who may be having heart attacks and strokes and need the hospital beds too. And so we're trying to keep our community as healthy as possible. I know we talked about this previously. How do you get this? But this was one of the questions that Shelley kind of wanted me to readdress in terms of as we go into the winter. Most of transmission is likely happening from breathing in droplets. So every time we breathe in and out, we're releasing droplets into the air that can linger in rooms, especially unventilated rooms. And people who are in those rooms can breathe those droplets in. The highest amount of spreading those kind of droplets come from coughing, sneezing, yelling, and singing, which is why we've seen reports of those of like choir practices and stuff being kind of ground zero for a lot of transmission. So probably most of the transmission that is happening in the community is due to breathing in droplets, and why masking is such a big deal and a big push. Less common, but not impossible, would be what we call fomite transmission, or touching surfaces where the virus is, and then touching your eyes, nose, mouth, and then and the virus getting into your body that way. This was a very big concern, especially early on, because the virus appears to be viable on certain surfaces like plastic for a long time. I would recommend a really nice visual can Google El País, which is I believe a Spanish newspaper. The graphic artist there made a really nice web-based interface to kind of give you a visual sense of how the virus actually can transmit in different kinds of rooms, and how ventilation and masking mitigate but do not make the risk zero for any individual person who's in that room. And this was a picture I showed back in May of like how one single sneeze can really disseminate aerosolized particles all over a room in a matter of a second. So this is to kind of get to the question of risk factors and how it plays into your disease as a pulmonary fibrosis patient. So back in May, I showed this data, which was kind of just the early data about comorbidities and your chance of being that 1 in 5 person that needed to be hospitalized. And so we knew from the early data that heart disease, lung disease, immune suppression, these things put you at risk for having disease. So this is an old slide from earlier. And, again, this is sort of the general mortality rates that were reported even early in the pandemic, showed that about 80% of people will recover without need for hospitalization. But once you're in that 20%, things can get quite risky. So I apologize, I'm at my mom's house, so somebody may have arrived. But there's observational data from the original 169 hospitals that was published back in May, looked at different risk factors. So being older, heart disease, COPD, and smoking were the initial risk factors that really stood out in that data. And overall in hospital mortality was about 6%, but was much higher if you had to be admitted to an ICU, which meant you needed either higher levels of oxygen flow or needed a mechanical ventilator to survive the pneumonia. And again, this is just graphically showing that for the things that sort of stood out as things that were higher risk were having being a smoker, having COPD, having heart disease. Oddly, well, again, it's not actually that odd, but male sex comes up again and again as a risk factor, and men in other viral illnesses too have a higher risk of more severe disease. So you will see that in a lot of the data, and including the ILD data that I'm about to, that Shelley mentioned that I'm about to share. So the first kind of big ILD specific study about risk and COVID-19 came out of Europe, where they looked, most of these patients are out of the UK and through the NHS databases, but include actually people from all different countries as well. Within Europe. And so they looked at as many people who had COVID-19 who had known previously diagnosed ILD and said, well, do those people do worse or better than people who of the same age and same age and general health status as people who didn't have ILD? Like as Shelley mentioned, the overall mortality for the ILD patients in this European cohort from earlier this summer was about 49%. And that was higher, statistically significantly higher than matched people at the same time who didn't have ILD, and that their mortality was about 35%. So the mortality in both groups is not great, but is higher in ILD patients. In particular, patients with ILD and obesity were at particularly high risk. And if you had worse baseline lung function as measured by your forced vital capacity, or FVC, that you probably talk about with your doctors at visits, that was associated with also being one of the people that did worse. This is a graph from that recently published paper. It just came out earlier this month. As you'll see again here, sorry, I'm going to get rid of people who are trying to message me. As you'll see here, they break it out by gender because as with other viruses, male sex appears to be higher risk than being female. So they broke that out just so you can see. And so the red lines are your kind of risk. Like, so if being over 75, the further right you are, is higher risk, and the ILD patients are the ones in red, and the no ILD patients are the ones in blue. And so they're trying to graphically represent for you what each clinical risk factor or characteristic, how that pushes your risk to the right, which would be worse risk, or to the left, which would be less risk of death. So that's kind of our preliminary data on that. And then, the bigger question that Shelley brought up about what happens. Okay, so there's the 49% that don't that pass away. So the 49% mortality in this group. It's not clear that is necessarily going to be the same mortality in the United States or in other countries, because, like I said, a lot of when things come down to mortality. They may be different now that we have, as Dr. Gottlieb can get into, a little bit more experience clinically in treating patients with COVID. So the European data is from a little bit earlier in 2020, when we were still figuring a lot of things out. So things like the consistent use of steroids in severe disease may not have been as uniformly utilized in this cohort. So it will be interesting going forward to see what U.S. Centers see in terms and European centers in the next wave see in terms of outcomes, because as you can see here, the mortality rate even for those without ILD was pretty high, was 35%. And so whether that mortality rate will remain that high going forward, it is not clear. So what can you do to protect yourself? We talked a lot about this in May, but I just wanted to put this slide out there. Avoid large crowds and gatherings. I want to emphasize this time that ventilated areas are better because we're in the winter. So being in ventilated areas is kind of harder because it's cold. And so, that's going to be a challenge for us, and why being really vigilant and careful in the winter is going to be really important. You want to avoid places where people can breathe, cough, or sneeze on you. Wear around a mask around others pretty much all the time if you can. So I'm at my mother's house right now because my husband's working and sleeping at our house. So my mom's part of our bubble. But even around my mom, because I'm still working and seeing patients, when I go downstairs, I'm wearing a mask around her, and she wears a mask around us. So as much as possible, doing that will decrease transmission, because a lot of reports, epidemiological reports now really emphasize that being in houses and having like family get-togethers a lot can, even when people are trying to be careful and not having huge parties, even gatherings of like 10 people and stuff can be niduses of transmission, because your family member may not know that they're carrying the virus and able to spread it. We talked about washing hands, not touching your face, and then of course, avoid being around anyone who's sick, any symptoms at all, but most importantly, people who've been around a known COVID-19 contact. Because again, they may be in that window or be the person that doesn't get sick but can still spread it. So if you have a family member who has a coworker or something that they share space with, who that coworker got COVID-19, I mean, that your family member is at risk until they're kind of out of the window. And so the more you can do to distance yourself from that person until they're out of about the 10 to 14 day window for potentially having disease, the better things are. What if I get sick? So we talked a lot about this in May. Mild disease is mostly supportive care. Dr. Gottlieb is actually running a number of outpatient studies for COVID right now that he can talk about. So I've had some of my patients get enrolled in who are not super sick, who are not in the in hospital studies. There are now outpatient studies, so looking at whether we can keep people from getting sick enough to come to the hospital. So generally, it's supportive care, self-isolate, wash hands, mask, use over-the-counter medicines like Tylenol and such with the advice of your own doctor about to control symptoms and fever. But there now may be clinical trials that are available that if your physicians can help you get connected with, that would be great. If you have severe symptoms, so how I describe that is difficulty breathing, increased oxygen requirement. So a lot of you are on oxygen already, but if you're having to turn it up higher to reach the same sats, that's a bit of a concern. Any chest pain or pressure. And then certainly if your family starts to notice that you're just kind of lethargic, not doing as much anymore, consider coming to the emergency room. You may need higher levels of oxygen than you're going to be able to give yourself at home. And you don't want to wait too long to get that kind of supportive care. Make sure you tell your doctors and nurses that you have COVID-19, and of course also that you are a chronic lung disease patient. And when my patients have gone to the emergency room, I've gotten phone calls from those emergency room physicians, and I've been able to clarify for them, this patient is super high risk. They have pulmonary fibrosis. They have so that they're taking extra care to make sure and to look for any need for hospital admission. So I'm always happy to talk to emergency room physicians, and I'm sure your ILD doctors are also going to be happy to give those emergency room physicians that see you and evaluate you, if you get sick, give them some guidance on your comorbidities. And of course, just to protect other people, please wear a mask if you do have to come seek care at a hospital. Is there treatment? I'm going to let Dr. Gottlieb get into this, because I think this is where this is sort of his area, especially vaccines. But certainly we've now learned from large trials that steroids may be very helpful. There isn't really a cure, but there are tons of large clinical trials going on at most major hospitals and research institutions looking at the precise and best role for antiviral medications, antibodies, and anti-inflammatory medications. Other things we know work are positioning of patients who have severe disease on their stomach. We've used that for a long time in ventilated patients who have severe lung disease, but it appears to be very important in COVID-19 care. And then in some cases, patients will need will have abnormal clotting, which can be something that needs to be addressed with anticoagulation. So that's another area of active research. I said this in May, and I still think this is true. This is likely to change how we live for a long time to come. For one, carefully done clinical trials take a long time to do. Vaccine development will take time, and even though there's a lot of promising stuff there that Dr. Gottlieb's going to talk about, it's going to take time to know what the risks are. And then after even getting approval, there will need to be a process that is likely going to be led by bodies like governmental bodies to determine how we distribute vaccines that to the most at-risk population, how to do that rationally. And so there's probably going to be a lot of private-public partnership public partnership about that in order to get things done in a timely manner, but that is also taking into account comorbidities and the risk of individual patients. So Shelley sent me a couple other questions, and I'll give a little bit of answer, and if Dr. Gottlieb has more to say on these, like, I certainly will look forward to hearing his thoughts on it too. She sent me that you guys were curious, is SARS-CoV-2 mutating? Yes, all viruses mutate as they spread over time. So this is how actually scientists know like different strains and can track how the same virus entered a country through different ports and different outbreaks. So all viruses do mutate over time, and SARS-CoV-2 is not any different in that sense. Whether this has made a huge difference in terms of how people are getting sick is still something that's being studied. I put out here just a figure from a Nature paper with a URL down there that you guys can kind of look at if you're into the science part of it and the nitty gritty, but they are showing that there are specific nucleotides in the actual sequence of the virus's DNA that are changing, that scientists can tell are changing over time when they sequence hundreds and hundreds of patients at different time points all over the world. So that is happening. That will happen, as it does with any virus, and whether or not it makes it more or less deadly for people is a question that remains to be seen. After being vaccinated, should we still wear masks for a while? Well, probably, because vaccines are not 100%. We all know this actually, because how many of you have known people who've gotten the flu even though they got a flu vaccine? We've all taken care of people who've gotten the flu even after getting vaccinated. So we don't know which vaccine is going to be the one or ones that get approved by the US and European regulatory agencies, but it's not likely that any vaccine is 100%. And so, especially when if the outbreaks continue and the prevalence is very high, even if one were to get vaccinated, until things are quite different in terms of the number of people getting sick, I would still say wearing a mask is probably smartest until things change on a more global level. In addition, something that, Bill and Shelley and I were talking about before the actual video started, is it may be we were talking about how a lot of my patients with chronic lung disease in general who have been able to avoid getting COVID, which is most of them, but not all, but most of them have been able to avoid actually getting COVID. Many of my chronic lung disease patients have actually had better years in terms of exacerbations of other things like their asthma and I have literally not had an upper respiratory tract infection since March, since this started. And so one of the things that we might want to think about as a community of chronic in chronic lung disease care is we know that getting viruses, even mild ones like regular old boring common cold coronavirus, can trigger worsening of your symptoms, your quality of life. It does that even for people who don't have lung disease, but it's particularly dangerous for people who have chronic lung disease and can cause, it can take you guys a lot longer than a normal and healthy person to get over regular viral illnesses. And so those of you who've undergone transplant have probably gotten used to wearing masks even before COVID when you're in certain situations. And I think it's an open question and something to consider, that even if this pandemic ends in the coming months, which we all hope that it does, that maybe wearing masks in certain public places where you're exposed to viral illness, maybe that may not be a terrible idea going forward to prevent kind of exacerbations of your underlying lung disease. That's something to be studied. It's kind of a kind of personal thing that I'm really interested in as a individual, but also as a doctor, because I think a lot of people have had better seasons in terms of the summer and fall with fewer breathing problems, because they've just gotten fewer colds. Not just that they've avoided COVID, but they've gotten fewer rhinovirus and all the other regular viruses that we all get. So it's something to think about and to, I think, for sure to be studied going forward. So I'll stop there. And if there are, general non-vaccine and non-clinical trial questions, I'm happy to address them. But these are just some of the resources that I think are good for when you guys want to look for kind of what's out there in the science and in terms of numbers and epidemiology. So thanks for your time. And I'll take any questions there are right now and then turn it over to Robert.
Would like to say that, by the way, Joe Malik, that is a cool costume, by the way, my friend. I will like to share some experience across the range of spectrum and just sort of expand. And I'm probably not going to be able to add a lot to what Dr. Mathai has already shared, because I agree with most everything that was said. Let me pull up my presentation. Give me 1 second. If I can find it. Let's see if I can hit it into the slideshow. All right. Are you able to see the slideshow? Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to share this with you. These are the Texas mountains. Because Dr. Mathai is used to putting pictures of mountains on her slide decks, this is Mount Dallas. I've also placed this as, the scary day of Halloween, 2020 AC, because BC was before COVID and now we're AC, the Ano COVID. Disclosures, nothing really of any major relevance. I'm a safety consultant for Gilead. I need to take this off about the EUA because the EUA is not an EUA anymore. It's actually approved for at least remdesivir. I agree with everything or almost everything Dr. Mathai says, except when she disagrees with me. And, I think even on the disclosure slide, I'm going to give you a little take on what I feel is really important. And, I'm going to say there's no such thing as cancer. There are cancers. And so there's no such thing as COVID-19. Well, the real reason why we called it COVID-19, because Lord knows no one wants to see COVID 2021. And I will actually provide a little bit of a bright spot. I think by August of 2021, we're going to be effectively past this. Now, people with IPF might want to take additional precautions for a little bit longer, but I don't think this is going to be endless. And in terms of the virus mutation, the virus does mutate, but I think that actually is not as extreme as other viruses. It's certainly not what we see with influenza virus. This is not a particularly fit virus, even though it can get us. And its very lethality might prompt it to actually passage or change incrementally to be less lethal over time. So there are some good things, but I do think I am personally a believer in the COVID passport, that once you get it and once you recover, your disease is likely to be less severe the next time, or even asymptomatic, and effectively immunity. And at least for several years, I don't really think there's any, for the duration of this pandemic, while there might be one or two people that might violate the rule, I certainly wouldn't live in fear of it. I'd live in more fear of a car accident, in terms of if you get it once and you make it through, then you're going to be okay the next time. Because you've already handled it, your body's there. And just because our tools are not necessarily good enough to show persistent immunity doesn't mean you don't have persistent immunity. It just means doctors aren't smart enough to come up with the right tools to look at that. So long and short of it on this slide, COVID-19, we should call it COVID-19A, COVID-19B, COVID-19C, different manifestations in different people. And the vast majority of people actually have minimal symptoms, but we do know risk factors for getting more ill. And a lot of our data on severity and risk factors a lot of it's based on inpatient populations. So let's talk about language a little bit. SARS-CoV-2 is the virus, and COVID-19 is disease. And once upon a time that was important, and now everyone uses it synonymously, and it's, the language purity has gone away a little bit, but COVID-19 is supposed to be the disease. So mitigation strategies, we can start with the end, and let's work backwards. We have salvage strategies of basically nuclear weapons for the immune system with immunomodulation and other heroic strategies. But we also, working backwards, we are working earlier and earlier in the disease process. We're working toward, we have antivirals now that are approved. Remdesivir is approved. It's only available IV because if you give it as a pill form, your body doesn't absorb it. I'm personally working on a trial for inhaled remdesivir outpatient because the idea is, well, if you get flu, you take Tamiflu early. We'll talk about that. And we want to give antivirals early. Neutralizing monoclonal antibodies. I think the important thing to remember here is this is effectively an analogy to designer plasma. I'm just a simple country heart failure transplant cardiologist that has a hard time keeping up with the lung lingo. But once upon a time we had willow bark for heart attacks. Now we have aspirin, and the same thing. We have this dirty mix of convalescent plasma, and then we have pure monoclonal antibodies, basically targeted antibodies against the virus that are very pure, very batch to batch specific, and we can go over that. Prevention and masking. Masking can actually help. Basically, different areas can ride the curve. If you're in China, you can drive it all the way down with masking. If you're in a Western country, if you're in the United States, you can actually drive it down. If you're on the East Coast, if you're in Texas, you can almost get it to come down, but it depends on what your citizens in Texas want to do. But if you take masking and you take a vaccine, and if you take a vaccine that's somewhat effective, not very, just somewhat, as long as it's safe, marginal efficacy will drive this down pretty quickly. And that will be very helpful. Testing is important. Timely testing is important. This is the year of the census. I wish we could do a census of COVID 2020 because that would also make this go away pretty quickly, or at least control it pretty quickly. I have some ideas that no one actually is going to listen to. And the other thing is, especially for the IPF group, most people that get COVID-19 actually make it through. A subset get sick, and the ones that get sick, depending on how sick somebody is, we can predict what the risk of making it through is. But for someone with IPF, I would say, I wouldn't wait for things to worsen. And I would rather overtreat patients with IPF with remdesivir, because I have lost one of my toolkits looking at how sick somebody is. I'd like to always treat someone as early as possible. I'd like to treat them before they become oxygen dependent. If you're already on oxygen, don't take the risk. Just, I would say, if you're already on oxygen and you get COVID, unless it's a reinfection, if it's your first infection, I would probably talk to Dr. Matai or your particular IPF physician and think about coming into the hospital for remdesivir until it's available in outpatient settings. So this is really says it all. Whoever said one person can't change the world never ate an undercooked bat. I think the slide has gone viral. And, you know, we've seen this before. We've seen the, quote, Spanish influenza. And I'm not going to talk politics, but I will tell you, there is absolutely nothing more American than this virus. We own this virus. We own the response to it. We are contributing the most to all the clinical trials. This is not a Chinese virus. This is a virus that did jump from human to man, but this is unequivocally not a Chinese virus because very few patients in China have it. This is an American virus, and that is what I think it should be called. So we think about the virus, but no one talks about the host. And Jimmy Kimmel said it perfectly when you can't have a virus without a host. And so part of it is the virus and part of it's humans. And you can't have a virus without the human, and you can't have a human without COVID. But it's really the interplay that we need to design, to understand. This is from last week. This is the hotspot. This looks extremely American, but not necessarily North America. And Canada's doing a pretty good job of keeping Americans out. And this is just a visual, just to say what I said again, that really, you need at least one lung to be vulnerable. We can scare people too much. Most people make it through. I'm a transplant cardiologist. I've had patients in some of my trials. One of my trials, for a time, I was joking around that 10% of my patients had a genetic identified cardiomyopathy in the trial, not because it was a risk factor, but because they happened to be my patients and I offered them the trials. But really, there's a lot of bad out of this, but we're also going to understand a lot more. And so perhaps this will make it safer for future. And I am hopeful that we'll even have some transformative technologies that will be studied starting next year that will actually be useful for other respiratory viruses in the future. It's funny, people keep saying, back during the pandemic, what? We've never had so many cases as in Dallas right now. I mean, it is surging. The other day, in one batch of positives, I saw that our census had gone up 10%. Now, we're not at the inpatient load yet that we were back in July, but we know where we're going. And we're not post-pandemic, we're in the thick of it. And now, in terms of one of the most absurd things I have ever heard was I was on a conference call with our system-wide team, and someone said, well, let's just see what happens during the summer if as they say, the summer's going to make it go away. And I, quite frankly, took that person to task because I have family members in Brazil, and I basically pointed out, if you want to know what is going to happen in heat, look to Brazil. This doesn't go away because depending on where you are, you just move inside. And so it's not that this is back now because it's cooler. It's back now because school's in session and there's more interaction. But in Brazil, everyone moves inside, in the air conditioning, and you have that interaction. It does spread easier inside than outside. I told you I wasn't going to talk politics. This is really not politics, but the most important thing to dispel is the phrase, I don't have symptoms, so I'm not going to wear a mask. If I get symptoms, I'll be the first one to wear a mask. That is not scientifically valid because it misses the window that someone's most infectious. And I'm going to walk through, if they display, a couple of slides that actually show you that. So I'm going to talk to you briefly about some of the monoclonal antibody trials. I don't know if Dr. Matai, if you saw the New England Journal article from Thursday. So at Baylor, we were fortunate to be a part of that. And that was just reporting on, does my cursor come up? So that was LY-CoV555, just rolls off the tongue. It's a neutralizing monoclonal antibody. It's fully human. It's from the sequencing the plasma cells that make the antibodies. And they found the Titus 1 in the first recovered US patient. They also have a Chinese patient that they did the same with, and now they have a combination. The reports that we had from last week were just for the single antibody rather than the combination. And this is really cool. This really says it all. This is not actually, this is a press release. This wasn't in the paper. This will be the next paper coming out. I'm not sharing any non-public data because this is on Lilly's website. And Regeneron is doing their own thing. Lilly's doing their thing. You know, you're going to have company XYZ coming out. They're going to be coming out of the woodwork, and everyone's going to have their favorite combinations. And so what we did was we were building a ship as we were setting sail. And so the question is, if you want to look at viral decreases with a therapy and viral loads, you have to find out when you want to choose your endpoint. And you might see a lot of things that are negative for endpoints, but they're actually positive. We just didn't ask the right question. And actually that happened in the inpatient trial just now of one of these antibodies as well. We designed our trial wrong, quite frankly. So if you ask the question, for example, what's your viral load in a month? Well, no matter what, if you get super sick, if you get slightly sick, if you get a therapy, if you don't get a therapy, your viral load in a month is probably very low. So certainly you wouldn't choose to look a month from now. So we chose to look at 11 days, how much virus could we detect? And in fact, even that was a little late. If you looked in the sort of the day 5 to 7 time frame, or even the day 3 to 7 time frame, you would see a difference in the top part is the natural history, and then 3 different dosings of a single monoclonal antibody, and then this is a combination of 2 monoclonals. What you can clearly see is the combination monoclonal works the best. But the best news, I would say, is look at natural history. Now, again, this is not just the virus causing the disease, it's also the body's unchecked immune response. But it's at least nice to know that the viral loads come down. And a lot of what we have problems with, is the spread of the virus. This is why masks work. Masks work because before you come to us, over here, this is where your viral loads are the highest. This is why masks work. Don't beware of your friends. Don't beware of your enemies. Beware of your friends. If you have a patient that's in the hospital and they're already contained and they're wearing a mask and they're in an isolation room, your healthcare workers are probably not getting that sick. A lot of our healthcare workers are getting sick outside the hospital rather than inside the hospital when they let their guard down. But this is good news for multiple different things. Not a lot of times you have industry doing a trial that informs on the disease as well as the therapy. This informs on the disease. This informs of who you should be afraid of. This also informs that the CDC wasn't terribly crazy when they said, for most people, if it's been 10 days since symptoms and you're 3 days symptom free, you're probably okay to move about the cabin. And it's because you're at least 1/1000th or 1 to 10,000th less infectious than you were a few days before. And then the second thing is these monoclonals will work. If you have IPF and your oxygen saturation is 94% or higher on room air, I can probably get you into a trial if you live in Dallas, including home health. And then if you are sick enough to need the hospital, or if you're on oxygen, I would personally recommend, in general, getting remdesivir in the hospital. We've also come up with a hypothesis that persistent high viral loads predict who gets hospitalized. So this is, the reds are the people that have gotten hospitalized, and everything else is everyone else. And so we have now looked, and we're looking at how our antibodies decrease the viral load as just off of a cut point. And we're also seeing if our initial signal of decreased hospitalizations with the neutralizing monoclonal antibodies, if that persists. So this is what we saw for hospitalizations. We saw that in placebo, we were having, in the high risk group, we had 20% of patients being hospitalized. In the combination monoclonal antibody, it was a couple percent. So we'd like to see, does this bear out? I'm sorry, this is not the hospitalization. This is the cut point analysis. Sorry, I apologize. And a lot of times people come to us and say, well, why do I want to participate in a trial that has, 50-50 chance of getting placebo or active? This is very unique because even people that get placebo do not get standard of care, because we're actually able to deliver what we should be able to deliver, which is research home health visits. And so house call. We're actually doing house calls through a trial for free, even for patients that are uninsured, which is, that's what medicine's about, right? Who cares what the funding is? As long as you got at least one lung or at least one heart, and if you have a problem, we should be able to help. And so in a way, it's actually refreshing to participate in research, at least during this period of time, because we can do something about it and we can help whoever needs the help and wants to be helped. On top of it, with that randomization of 50-50 chance of getting the therapy, convalescent plasma, which is in the news, probably you only have about a 1 in 10 chance of getting a high quality, high titer convalescent plasma. And as Willobark is to aspirin, so is convalescent plasma to neutralizing monoclonals. And so you get a lot of fiber and other carry-on things that you don't really need in the convalescent plasma. So that's why this is good. Again, COVID-19, we should have a COVID-19 A, B, C. Lord knows we're not going to do COVID-19 2021 because that's the wrong message. But we should call it subtypes. A rose by a rose called any other name, it smells just as sweet, but in this case, it's the opposite. Not all COVID-19 is the same. We call it mild, moderate, severe, but even then, that's probably not enough. COVID-19 responses require a virus and a host. If you want to give an antiviral, we want to work upstream as much as possible. So you might have heard that the inpatient trial for neutralizing monoclonal antibodies, the first arm of that trial was stopped for futility. There was no evidence of harm. I actually don't think we should have stopped the inpatient trial, because I think we should have designed it correctly and thought about it. We didn't have the data I just showed you. And so we were just looking, where's somebody on day 5? And it was really meant, the initial group was meant as a safety analysis, not an efficacy analysis. And to stop it for futility or inefficacy is kind of silly, because we didn't look at the quantitative viral loads, the amount of virus in the nose in the inpatient trial, because that was an NIH trial, and we just didn't design it to do that. We should have. And we should go back to the drawing board and we should ask the same question again using that. And then also the primary endpoint is actually, where is the patient at day 90 and how quickly did they get there? So that the jury is still out on that. We don't know the answer. But if we want to move upstream, Tamiflu, you want to take it in the first 48 hours if you can, right? After getting flu. Tamiflu, of course, won't work for COVID, but we want to move antivirals upstream. So outpatient, if we get it early, don't wait, give the antibody. What does the future hold? I don't know. I don't care. Just give the therapy. Shoot first and hope, if you were destined to recover, you're going to recover. If you weren't destined to recover, this could help you recover. And then the inhaled remdesivir, the antiviral that we know works, as a survival benefit, decreases time to recovery. Remdesivir, we were giving it late because it's only available IV. If you give it a pill, you don't absorb it. So if we can give it as an inhalational therapy, then that will also be helpful. We're fortunate, Baylor Scott and White, to have treated the most patients worldwide with that therapy, and that trial is ongoing. This is just a schematic for remdesivir. Basically, it's the virus tries to copy its genetic material, and we basically put a kink in it, and it can't continue on. It is fully and formally approved. You might hear that remdesivir can increase liver function tests, but that's if you give it to healthy people. If you give it to people with COVID increases liver function tests in a lot of the sick patients. And there's less of an increase of liver function tests with remdesivir than without it in patients that are hospitalized with COVID. We've studied remdesivir in clinical trials in over 10,000 patients now, in addition to the hundreds of thousands of patients that have received it from standard of care. And then last week's announcement from the FDA was not its first approval. Japan had actually fully approved it months ago. This is a study from the NIH showing the benefit of remdesivir for hospitalized patients. You can see that it increases time or decreases time to recovery. We're in all of the different groups of patients, with the one exception of patients that are already on a ventilator at the time, but in everyone else it does have a difference. We don't know that if it's inefficacious here, because we also don't know where are these patients at month 2. You know, if it doesn't have a difference by day 28, but it helps by day 60, that would be good to know. So jury's still out on here. You know, if someone's hospitalized with flu, I'm still going to give Tamiflu, even if it's late. And so if someone has COVID, I'm still going to give remdesivir, even if it's late, because I don't know what comes out here. But in all these other groups, let's say you're already on oxygen, I'm not going to even take a chance to see if you would meet the criteria for the typical worsening because someone's already on oxygen. I would just look at this data and say, I'd rather have remdesivir because I'm going to recover quicker than placebo. There's a lot of clotting issues. That's my only point in the slide. So it's more than that. This is a slide just to show that we've learned decades ago from Dr. Matai and her colleagues in the ARDSNet trials of lung protective ventilation, so that we don't save all the other organs and then trash the lungs by using high pressures. So we have to do lung protective ventilation. This is an animal model where just even a few minutes of high pressure can actually irreversibly damage the lung. We need to be cognizant of that. What we have learned here is a lot of patients can actually go onto their stomach and actually avoid the ventilator or be on the ventilator less time if we start off with this. And by what we call prone positioning for spontaneous ventilation without a ventilator. We learned that works. We learned that steroids work and decrease the morbidity and mortality, basically improves the survival. I was a huge skeptic of steroids based on what everything else everyone was saying early on. And I am now a huge believer in steroids for this if someone's on oxygen. If you're not on oxygen, I don't think it's beneficial except in very selected circumstances. And so I don't prescribe it to someone that's not on oxygen or unless they have very high inflammatory markers. But this is what we learn, we study, we acknowledge what we were wrong about. We also have artificial lung machines that I knew would work, and yet we had guidelines that said, well, don't use ECMO. We also had people in Italy saying that. We had people in New York saying, 80% death rate on ventilators for COVID-19. And I would say it was 80% death rate for patients in that hospital system in New York at that early time. We never had that experience here. We had patients passing away on the order of 25 to 30% if they were on a ventilator. And our ECMO survival rate actually in our system is about 58%, which is tremendous. I'll just skip that. This is just to say there's a couple different things in this disease. It's not all the lungs. It is the lungs, and it's also clotting disorders. One of the questions that comes up is, should patients be transplanted for COVID-19? And I think that some of the patients that are being transplanted for COVID-19 Some of them, there's a couple that might truly need it, but some of them might need it because of different methods that were used to save the patient other organs during that time, or in the case of this, of probably actually blood clots and other things. So it is related to COVID-19, but there's a lot of times where I've seen chest x-rays like this that have dramatically, wonderfully, and impressively improved really late. And so time does tell what someone's going to do, and it's good to not presuppose what's going to happen. We just need to make sure that as we support someone that is sick enough to be hospitalized, that we do things to make sure that we're not causing additional damage by our support. Point of this is just as a cardiologist, if I'm trying to protect the heart, I rest the heart. And if I want to protect the lungs, you need to rest the lungs. And the only problem is people are very addicted to breathing, so it's hard to rest the lungs for too long. This is a good news. These are patients. None of these patients were expected to survive without ECMO, and we had a 58% survival to discharge, which, I'd rather you not get that, someone not get that sick, but this is really tremendous. This is what the Italians told us not to do. They told us, don't even try. And then this is international series that basically internationally, they have a comparable, this is mortality is sort of the opposite, but that's what they were seeing in this international registry. This, I don't want to focus on this other than it's a very pretty figure, and look at green. Green changes with time. Look at orange. Orange changes with time. The point is, if you look at the literature, if someone tells you data, you need to know more, because you need to know, are you looking early or are you looking late? Because ultimately what we're looking for is helping someone recover and get back home, or preferably not get sick. This is a case of a healthcare worker that got COVID. You can see the lungs weren't too bad to begin with. This was a young patient, in their 20s. And you see a breathing tube here. You see bad COVID pneumonia. And also what you see is, this is actually an artificial lung machine draining the lungs. And needed a breathing tube, a tracheostomy, was off of the ECMO. And this is at 6 weeks. I thought this patient would have needed a lung transplant. This is not a good chest x-ray. But at 6 weeks, 1 week later at 7 weeks, this is a chest x-ray. No more breathing tube. Most importantly, I don't know, Dr. Matai, I think these lungs are lungs that, you'd be okay with in your patients in clinic. I mean, you'd trade for these lungs on a lot of your patients. So we don't know enough about this disease. We need to study it more, because some of the elements can actually improve dramatically at late time points, as long as we haven't overloaded the lungs with pressure. This says it all. We have to try to prevent the disease as we can. We don't need fancy therapies if we can prevent. We can wash hands, we can wear a mask. If you live in China, this works. If you live in Texas, it works if everyone around you is observing the same thing. And so I would encourage you, if you're able to wear a mask, wear a mask. And the type of mask will determine whether you're protecting somebody else or you're protecting yourself. And then from that, I really want to go on to vaccines. So vaccines, people have said, which vaccine is the best? I don't know. Dr. Matai, people are not just in Texas. This is throughout the country.
It's all over the world.
All over the world. Perfect. All right. Sorry to be Texas-centric. So since we're all over the world, I'm going to, let's see. I'll use two analogies. I'll use a Wayne Gretzky analogy, and I'll use a Ronaldo analogy. If you want, you cannot win a hockey game at 0-0. You cannot win a football game at 0-0. You have to take multiple shots on goal, at least one, but preferably multiple, to try to get something successful. And what you need is something that is, number one, safe. And then you just need it to be somewhat effective. It doesn't need to be perfect, because masks, at least in the United States, can just barely could control things if we decided to wear them more. Since we have something that's hovering on growth and regression, if you take a vaccine that's even somewhat effective, it will drive the case count down. So the Wayne Gretzky model, or the Ronaldo model of COVID, is 100% of your shots on goal that you don't take on goal don't go in. So take more shots on goal. Have a couple of different vaccine trials. We're going to get different readouts at different time. I've been asked the question, well, which vaccine should I get? I would say, get the vaccine that is safe, that is at least somewhat effective, and that you actually have access to. Because don't look for the things you don't have around you. Don't look for perfection. Look for safety and adequate efficacy. And I think some of them will be more efficacious than we expect, but they're not going to be 100%. And there's going to be supply chain issues. We are already building up the supply ahead of time, because there are transport issues, storage issues. Some of them require refrigeration at 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Some require refrigeration at 50 degrees Fahrenheit negative. Different vaccines have different requirements. So, and Susan, Dr. Matai, would you be able to, the questions again were, is the virus mutating? Yes, it's mutating, but don't be fearful of the mutations. I personally believe in the COVID passport. If you get it once and you survive it and you recover, I wouldn't live in fear. I would continue to wear a mask, mainly to be a good ambassador for others, so that you don't get others sick, even if you're not infectious, to help others not get sick from other people, to basically just be a role model for the community, if you're able to.
I think one question that, and you may have some more insight into this, kind of because of your experience with clinical trials, a lot that I get a lot from my patients, and I'm sure is on the mind of a lot of people, is there's a lot of, and this may be an unanswerable question, and that's okay, but it's gonna be great to hear from you if it is. A lot of people my patients are really concerned about like timeline, like, okay, when is the vaccine, when are there going to be these options for vaccines? And do you feel like, for being on with involved in so many clinical trials, there's a sense of that, or whether that's just an unknowable right now because we don't have full data and efficacy yet?
So, some of there's some trials that are still enrolling, some that have finished their enrollment and will have interim database locks and reads. So the Moderna vaccine has filled its enrollment and is just in the follow-up, and so that's a demonstration of efficacy. I don't know if Pfizer has filled their enrollment yet. These are called mRNA vaccines, where basically the vaccine is the instructions to how to make the spike protein, and so then your body makes it and then generates the immune response. You're going to see things just like you did with remdesivir, where you had an authorization first and approval later. So authorization is going to occur when you think that something is clearly, convincingly safe, even if you don't have all the efficacy data yet. And then approval will come when you have a reaffirmation and reconfirmation of both efficacy and safety. So I think you could get something in December for an authorization. And then I think you could get approvals potentially even January to February, maybe. Some things that took 6 months to do. Sometimes we've gotten things that took 6 months to do it done in 8 days. Our first patient in remdesivir in Dallas, we had reached out to the sponsor 8 days before, and within 8 days we were able to get the drug here, the FDA documents in line, all our regulatory things done. And we actually didn't have any patients in the hospital when we first started that conversation. And with 8 days, we actually had those hospital patients that needed it. And so the timelines are compressed. It doesn't mean that we're sacrificing quality because we did everything that we would otherwise do. It's just we took a lot of resources and pivoted a lot of resources onto the task at hand.
The other thing that comes up a lot and that I've talked to a lot of my patients about in clinic visits is that a lot of my patients have asked me, well, how are they going to decide who gets it? And my understanding of this is that there's likely going to have to be a lot of involvement with like the CDC and FDA in deciding how to distribute it. But I wonder if you have any thoughts or if there have been conversations, you know, in these clinical trials about how to actually deploy.
And Dr. Gottlieb, why don't you close out your screen so we can get everybody to see you and good, yeah. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Perfect.
Yeah. Okay.
So the question was
Like, how do they decide who gets it?
Oh, yeah.
You know, like, is it going to be the like government, the FDA, you know?
So there are guidance materials already being distributed from the FDA, from the government, HHS, as well as different state health departments of health, and your supply is going to be generated as to where the need is for one. And so if your community does a really good job at controlling things, you might actually take longer to actually get the vaccine, which is, you know, it's a paradox, right? And the priorities include healthcare workers as well as patients that are exceptional risk. So healthcare workers and essential workers, and essential workers in here can include EMS, fire, police, grocery clerks, you know, people driving, transportation pilots. Those are essential workers. And then the question is, even among those, then how do you prioritize? And so it's going to be, that's why it's really important to focus on the supply chain now. And that's why that's so critical, supply chain and production, because those are very hard decisions. We at least have concrete rules. It'll be much more transparent in those rules. And there's a very rigid set of systems for putting where do teachers fall in, where do other job tasks fall in, where, et cetera. And it's designed to be, number one, hopefully maximal benefit to society. Number two, transparent. And number three, just. So hopefully rationally based as to minimizing spread. Basically, if you think about hub and spoke model, take people that are at the highest risk of contacting other people, both either risk to themselves or at most risk of having increased contacts. For example, your grocery clerks and your mass transit drivers, et cetera. And then teachers obviously fall into that group. Because if you can stop transmission through a couple of hub and spoke people, you can also impact.
Dr. Gottlieb, do you have time for questions from the audience?
Yeah, I have about 10 minutes and then I have to actually finish enrolling a patient.
Oh, okay. All right. I have one quick one for you. I actually read that 1918 pandemic book, which was a bad idea during a pandemic, but we've made, you know, a lot of the same mistakes that were made in 1918. You'd think we'd have a blueprint, but now do we have, with all the work science has been doing, do we have a blueprint going forward how to handle this thing effectively?
This virus or other viruses?
The other viruses that will come along. We're being told there will be more in our future.
I think, you know, if you ever have an emergency, if you're a pilot and if you're Sully and you land in the Hudson and you have success, you debrief at what you did right and what, even though you did everything, you did obviously the right stuff, what you could have done better. So as we land this plane, we need to basically, as society, debrief and maybe debrief absent politics and use the science that we know, but also the science we haven't yet learned, and see what else comes out to be as rational, as dispassionate, and as strategic as possible. I do hope that there's a technology, I think, that I've been participating in developing to hopefully get into a clinical trial early next year, that I think could be transformative for multiple different viruses down the line. And we've now, for the first time, the article that I was on Thursday in New England Journal is the first time we've ever actually shown a neutralizing monoclonal antibody synthetically produced actually having an effect clinically with the data. Everything else has been promise. Everything has been, promising study, promising thought. Well, this actually is the data. And now you're going to see a floodgate of data from this trial and other trials. This was Lilly, there's going to be Regeneron, there's going to be AstraZeneca, Vir. It's everyone. You're going to have enough different variations of a theme that we're going to get the signal.
Great.
We'll also learn a lot more about how to do science. I mean, we didn't, unlike 1918, we didn't have the ability to sequence the virus back in 1918. We didn't have the downside of social media, but we also didn't have the upside of genetic sequencing, and we didn't even have just next generation sequencing. We had no generation sequencing. And hopefully now this time we'll understand that masks really do work for these. I don't expect the US to wear masks forever and ever, because I do believe that there are things like polio that taught us it's not necessarily good to be too clean. I think we do need exposure to the environment. We do need exposure to viruses, because if you have a blank slate immune system, then you're going to get tipped over whenever you get sick. So we do need to, at some point in the future, put down the mask, but we also need to be able to put it back up if we need to.
Okay. You want to take a couple of other questions before you have to leave? Anybody have a question for?
Yes, I do. First question is, when you've got the line of people getting priority to the vaccine, where do IPF patients sit? Are we before the grocery clerks or after the grocery clerks?
I'd have to go back to that HHS statement. If you want to give me a second, I can try to pull it up. And let me see.
I didn't realize they'd made that public, but
I know I've gotten it. Let me see if I can. It might take a minute. They have definitely, I mean, the thing I'm looking at is oh, good God.
it is actually searchable. I think I found it also.
COVID-19 vaccination program interim playbook for just jurisdictional operations. Let me just download this. And then I can. So just to show you, for example, the level of detail here. Oops, I don't want to share my own screen, that screen. I'll show this. So you can see that there's a very long document. This is why I can't roll things off the top of my tongue. So let me just see.
I think one thing to keep in mind is, even if as Dr. Gottlieb's scrolling to the specific, try to answer the specific question. I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that indirectly, even if, like, of course, I completely understand, being a doctor for IPF patients, how stressed people like may be about where exactly in the line they fall. But one of the things Dr. Gottlieb mentioned to like kind of draw your attention to it is like when he was talking about like finding spokes in the wheel. I mean, one of the ways, even if essential workers do get vaccinated before people with chronic lung disease, that does protect you, because the people you're likely to get this from, if you're taking some minimal precautions, the likely people you're going to get this from are the essential workers in your life, like the person you buy your groceries from, like your doctor, like your nurse, and so even if HHS decides to distribute like to essential workers, to a grocery clerk before you, that still protects you, because unless you're going out to rallies and rock concerts right now, your rational, like the place you're most likely to get it is going to be interacting with essential workers.
Any other questions? And by the way, Bill Vick is his computer locked up, so
I'd like to ask one question, if I might.
yes.
Okay, just in terms of face masks, is there a preferred type of face mask? Now, my reason, I guess, for asking that is I haven't heard anybody outside of, you have to cover your mouth and your nose. And I see other places where they're just wearing a screen plexiglass, or not plexiglass, but a plastic face shield, as it were. Is there a preferred a brand or style or type that is, I guess, one that's used most often or is recommended? Because I haven't heard anybody. There's certainly lots of them showing up on the grocery store shelves.
So
but I'm not sure if they're any good or not.
So the first thing is to make sure that you're doing something that's helpful, not harmful. So there is emerging data to say that if someone takes a piece of simple clothing, non-layered, that's a screen, like a balaclava or a scarf, that actually might be harmful in certain situations, and it might actually promote aerosolization and smaller particles. So it needs to be a mask. It has to be at least 2-ply or an official surgical mask, or official, or an N95, et cetera. So
I'm sorry, N95 or M95?
Well, so surgical masks work to decrease the spread of the virus from the person that is wearing the mask. So if you're in a crowd of 100 people and 50 are wearing masks and 50 are not wearing masks, you're probably not protected. You're not 50% protected, you're probably not protected. But if you're in a place where everyone's wearing masks, then you actually do have the benefit of that protection. There is some protection that's afforded by wearing a surgical mask, but it's not perfect, and I wouldn't rely on it. And so I personally believe the best mask is one that's, number one, not harmful. So not just taking my shirt and trying to breathe through my shirt. That's not going to work. Don't do something harmful like pulling the balaclava. The second the issue is the mask that you can get and obtain. If you can't get an N95, don't obsess about an N95, because also an N95 only works if you can wear it. So if all you can get is a surgical mask, then a surgical mask is better than nothing.
Okay, I'm not to interrupt, but that brings up another point. Being an IPF and being short of breath, I find that the N95 is difficult to breathe through. So that's, I guess, the reason why I'm asking.
To breathe through, even, I mean, that is, we, like Dr. Gottlieb and I, we're basically essentially we're an N95 all day long.
Right.
And so it is hard for us to breathe through it. So yeah, that's understandable.
I could share what I do, because there are ways to make it. There are ways that are hard to breathe in through, but not out through. But you have to be careful with it. So if you're around people that are wearing masks and all you see is valved masks, they're protecting themselves, they're not protecting you. You're getting exposed to all the breath that they're exhaling. So it doesn't count if you're around people that have valved masks. Now, on the other hand, some of the N95s are valved. And what you can do is what I do is I wear the valved N95, but then I put a surgical mask in front of it. Okay. So I'm at least as good as, and probably pretty much just comparable to, my protection of others is comparable to having the surgical mask. Now, on the other hand, I never take my mask off from the time I get out of my car until the time I'm back in my car. So from that standpoint, since I don't have it, I don't feel terrible for protecting people with only a surgical mask, because I do believe that is the right thing. It sends the right message, and I have not. Dr. Matai can tell you that I'm half the person I used to be, because I haven't taken the mask off in the hospital since March. I found that the mask is a great dietetic response. I can't jam chocolate through the mask.
Good point. In relation to that, do you find, being that is part of your profession to wear a mask all the time, do you find that you get rash or some kind of pathogens between your mask and your face?
It's very irritating. I have marks on my face. I think one of the key things is, just as you get used to wearing glasses where your earpieces fit, I do move. I make sure I keep a good seal, but I sometimes move if I find that it's low riding. I do bring the mask up like a swimming, like your swim goggles. I adjust the position so that I'm not giving myself pressure wounds.
Okay. I find I can't see because my glasses
questions.
fog up.
I have a couple quick
Now, if your glasses fog up, the question is, depending, so my glasses might fog up depending on which N95 I use, depending on how the exhaust is set up. I do find that when I have my own N95 and I have a surgical mask in front of it, it actually takes any of the moisture and puts it away from the glasses. Yeah, I don't
So
have a
double
conflict
masking
with Rain-X, but
the double masking in that sense can be helpful.
Yes.
I agree with Dr. Gottlieb.
And I think we have one more question coming up.
Thank you.
I have a question, kind of a two-part question. One is, who do we really use as a resource to find out good information? Because most of our information is coming from some source that might be politically bent. And part of the reason, especially with the vaccines coming out, some states are saying we're not going to have any vaccine until we test it ourselves. So that kind of a political spin on some states. Second part is I have a lot of the symptoms, COVID symptoms every day, because I'm on O2 and my underlying condition. So how do I know when it's not my underlying condition and it's COVID?
So if this is an international audience, I'm going to take that last part and start with it, because I think we missed an opportunity. I don't think it's entirely too late. I don't think it's going to happen, but I'm just going to throw it out there. In the United States, 2020 is the year of the census. And testing can be done in ways that are effective and helpful and control the pandemic, and it can be done in ineffective ways. In the past, for vaccines, we have national vaccination days for different things like polio, et cetera. We could say 2020 is the year of the census, and we're going to take a census of COVID-19, and we're going to take the census every week, because what reaches every man, woman, and child in the United States, and it's not Santa Claus, because there are a diversity of backgrounds, and it's not Amazon. There's still some places that don't get it very easily, but it's the US Postal Service. It's not meant to be political. It's meant to service everybody, and it usually works about 6 days of the week. If the powers that be were creative, they could do things like set up mass saliva testing. And I believe you could have put a machine in every zip code, put out the samples enough for every man, woman, and child in each household, drop them off in the mailbox, pick them up the next day, run them overnight, and then put the postcard with the results back in your mailbox the next day. You could take a census of where the virus is And then you could be rational about quarantine. If you're positive or have symptoms, you quarantine. If you're negative or don't have symptoms, then you're free to move about the country or the cabin. And if you did that and you repeated it once a week for 8 weeks, I think your caseload would drop dramatically. And then we would be able to actually see the data that's going to roll in from the vaccine trials to then allow vaccines to be rolled out in ways that there's not the immediate rush to get the Cabbage Patch doll at the front, that we all have access to the vaccine. In terms of symptoms, you are right. Most of you have shortness of breath every day, and nothing's going to be perfect. And even then, there's some of you that would actually be asymptomatic carriers effectively, if not for your ILD. So we don't have the answer to that, other than the answer to that really relies in if we could develop a nationwide surveillance system that allowed efficient, repeated testing, even in asymptomatic states, that could drive things down dramatically. And I would still propose that if I was elected. I'm not running for anything though.
Yeah, I think what I tell people, like practically for you guys, is if you notice a change, if there's a significant change in your symptoms, and particularly if you start to have things like fever. I mean, fever is like we gotta figure it out if you have it. If you have a significant change in your symptoms, if you start to feel like you have the flu, these are reasons to get tested, and why my patients have gotten tested. But there's no, I can understand. I think it's very understandable why a lot of our patients feel panicked, because they're like, how do I know? I'm short of breath every day. And that's totally legit question. And there's no perfect answer, but any big change from your baseline, if things do not feel right, and certainly if you have a fever, call your doctor. We will try to get you tested. And I have just to address the state thing. I actually have not heard of it. I think when things play out in reality, so drugs are not approved by state. The FDA approves drugs for use. So if there is a vaccine that goes through all of the testing and stuff that, Dr. Gottlieb is helping a lot of different things do across the country, if it gets approved by the FDA, I think that it's not likely that any individual state is going to legitimately be able to block its use. I would be really shocked by that. I mean, stranger things have happened, but I have not heard any. I have not heard that, and I'm pretty well read on the news. I don't know if you've heard that from any state, Dr. Gottlieb, but I've not heard any state say that.
I know California has made those statements from the state level, and I think New York also. I think those might just be political type statements, but that's what
I know. I have many friends in California and New York who are physicians, and I don't think that, like I said, states do not approve medications. The FDA approves medications. When I am trying to prescribe OFEV for one of you guys, it's not because Texas approved OFEV for the use of IPF. It's the FDA has the indication by the FDA for this is this, and that's how I get it covered for my patients. So I think that the states may say they're going to follow the formal FDA guidelines. Okay. But it's still generally medications are approved on a federal on an FDA level. And then, but I don't think there's any serious concern that a efficacious vaccine that is safe and it goes through the appropriate chain of approvals. I cannot imagine that an individual state is going to block that. Unless, and I mean, it would have to be in an extraordinary circumstance. And I think that they would face massive, bipartisan, like, because this is a public health problem. I mean, we're a country, right? So if we had a vaccine that really worked and we were giving it to everybody except for Oklahoma, I mean, then Oklahomans can still spread it to Texas and Arkansas and all the other states. So it becomes a federal problem. So I would be really shocked if that happens. And I would look carefully at the sourcing and who is saying that and what their motivations might be.
Thank you.
Regarding the OFEV, does taking OFEV when you're COVID positive increase the quarantine time, or is it still based upon CDC guidelines?
Yeah, there's no difference in your in being on OFEV in terms of the general recommendations. I mean, that may be something that would be that may be interesting and a topic of study when we have. But as you can see, I mean, IPF and ILD are relatively rare, even in Europe, which was an early epicenter of the pandemic. Even with a very centralized health services, that study that I talked about that Shelley asked me to talk about a little bit, that was only I think 300 patients or something. So it's going to be real granular questions like, okay, is OFEV or Esbriet better to be on for COVID risk? That's going to take a lot of time to tease out. But right now, there's no specific, if you're on Esbriet or OFEV, that you need to do something different than the standard.
Okay, we've probably kept you all long enough. And gosh, Dr. Mathai, Dr. Gottlieb, thank you so much. This has been absolutely wonderful. We really appreciate you very much. And on Thursday, November the 5th, we have another program coming up. It's going to be a meeting on virtual trials in telemedicine with Dolly Kravitsky. And I hope you all can come. After that, we will have one November 14th also with Dr. Leanne Silhan on how to be safe over the holidays when people want to eat and get together and have fun. It might not be time for us to have fun yet. We'll find out, though. So thank you again. We appreciate
Thanks.
your
And
time. Yes.
Actually, I just wanted to say I sent the link in the chat to Bill of the HHS document because it's actually it looks like it's publicly available, at least a version. Dr. Gottlieb may have a more granular one, but there is a publicly available HHS document looking at talking about kind of their approach, and that may be something that it sounds like that may be a topic people may want to read more about. So I sent the link to Bill, and feel free to email that out.
Yes, absolutely.
One last thing. I think the messaging right now should be very different from the messaging in March and April. In March and April, the message was stay home unless you're sick enough to need the hospital. And if you were in New York, the message was still stay home. That shouldn't be the answer here. If God forbid someone gets sick and does get diagnosed with COVID and they have ILD, I would say don't stay home. Either get into a clinical trial outpatient, or if you're on oxygen, get hospitalized and get remdesivir.
And if you're in Dallas, I'm sure UT Southwestern has a number of similar trials. Obviously, Baylor does. My patients have been enrolled in them. So make sure to, check with your ILD center. Especially if you get a positive COVID result, check with your ILD doctor and bring up you make sure you're getting the right care. Make sure that the doctors caring for you in the hospital are communicating with your ILD physician so they know, they can tell them this person has underlying lung disease, blah, blah, blah. And then also to make sure that you're screened for appropriate clinical trials and have that option.
Right.
And then now we would have the envelope we're going to have the awarding of the prize for the best costume. And the winner is Joe Malik.
Yes, we have got cups on the way, and there will be other ways to win these wonderful coffee cups. And there may be more than one winner besides Joe Malik. There were so many good masks. Thank you again. Have a wonderful weekend. Enjoy Halloween. Don't eat too much candy. Thank you, Dr. Gottlieb and Dr. Mathai. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Take it easy,
guys.
y'all.
Thank you, doctors.
Bye.
Bye.